Authorities are struggling to understand why a co-pilot intentionally took down a German Air Wings Airbus with 150 people on board. Aviation expert and author Ken Jenkins joined KLIF's Dave Williams and Amy Shodroff on the investigation.
It seems that we found out a lot quickly about this co-pilot and that he may have suffered from some sort of mental problems. Do you think that could have caused him to go on this mass suicide mission?
Well, it certainly appears that way from what we're hearing from the investigative reports, and I certainly have to agree with you that it's a very quick conclusion, considering we're really only into day 3 of, or moving into day 4 of this event. Sometimes it takes a year or two to have a conclusion as to what brought down the plane, and yet somehow this has been done in a matter of days.
Yeah, that's what got me, Ken, was the rapidity of the report coming from official sources in France, saying, well, this guy had some problems, and he did it intentionally, and he locked the other officer out of the cockpit. What kind of background investigation goes into pilots typically?
Well, and good morning, Dave. When it comes into the pilot hiring, it's a very strict and rigorous process. And it's not as if you just walk in and apply and see if you have the aptitude for it. Many pilots come from, of course, the military background where they've been vetted already, and then the airline continues to vet through their process. Of course, there's 2 sides to the process. One is the aptitude, the educational background and whatnot, which is very rigorous. And then there's a psychological background, and that varies from airline to airline as to the depth and intensity. But once the pilot's brought on board, you very seldom see any follow-up on the psychological side. It's more of a self-disclosure that the pilot is supposed to perform versus somebody through the medical process finding out what could be wrong.
So a pilot who's been flying for a number of years could develop some sort of a mental disorder, and the airline would never know about it.
Exactly right. There's, it's such a hard job to obtain, Amy, into becoming a commercial pilot that once they obtain it, you really don't want to let it go, of course, and I can understand that motivation. I don't even know that psychological testing on a yearly basis is the cure-all, because what happens from the day that you're tested and then a year later? So let's say 6 months in between that yearly test, something happens, it could still, fall through the cracks. I think the immediate fix, or at least to reduce the risk, is for Europe and Asia to follow the 2-person cockpit rule that the United States already has in place.
Ken, we know that in your business, you are one of the people that personally assists crash survivors and the family members of victims, and that you were involved in doing exactly that for the Malaysia Air families. What about this situation? How is that approached? What is the most important part of somebody in your position?
Well, Dave, and it's very interesting about your question. Yesterday, when this came out that the co-pilot may have had depression and whatnot and brought the plane down, I called a friend of mine that it shouldn't be a friend, to be honest with you. She was somebody that lost her brother on an airplane disaster 20 years ago, and somehow we met about 10 years ago, and she's now a clinician in social work. And I called her and I asked her, I said, as a family member, how do you feel when you hear that the pilot caused the accident? And she said, I'm just as shocked and emotional about it as anyone would be. She said, but the only good thing about it for the family members is now they have an answer. She said they know what happened. And she said, if you look at Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, the plane that disappeared, those families still don't have an answer and what they would give to have one. And she said, it's not much hope to say that you have an answer, but at least you have that.
Good point there. So you're going to go over and help some of the families in this situation?
No, I don't think so. And the main reason is that Lufthansa and Germanwings have a very robust program. They participate quite heavily in IATA and ICAO, which are 2 of the governing agencies with regards to aviation. And I have worked with them in the past when I was with American Airlines and then with BMS Global here in Fort Worth. They have quite a good response plan, and I think they're doing a great job with working with the families and being forthcoming with the information they have.
So this morning, Ken, we've learned that airlines in Germany and in other European countries have decided to immediately put in place the protocol that U.S. airlines already have, and that is to not allow one person to remain on the flight deck in the cockpit alone. How many people typically are on board an aircraft like this? I mean, in the cockpit?
Well, and that will vary from airline to airline and the length of the flight. Typically, it's a two-person cockpit, and I say it may vary. If it's a longer flight, you may have a relief pilot where one will be in the cabin, and then they'll switch out to provide relief and respite for the pilot that's flying the plane. In this particular case, there were two, and there were 4 flight attendants. And so what would happen is, if a pilot needs to leave to go to the restroom or get something to drink, a flight attendant will step in. And usually what you see in the U.S. carrier side is the flight attendants will use a galley cart to block the door, which is another barrier, if you will, to get to the cockpit.